My name is Josh Fell, and today I'll be talking to you about licensing and transfer of IP, or intellectual property. So, what is intellectual property? WIPO, or World Intellectual Property Organization, defines intellectual property as creation of the mind, such as inventions, literary and artistic works, designs and symbols, names and images used in commerce. And I wanted to go over this quickly before we got into the actual licensing and transfer of IP, because without actually knowing what intellectual property is, then we won't understand what licensing and transferring of intellectual property is. And so I'm not going to stay on this long. I just thought I would give you some examples of intellectual property, which we all are familiar with. It's copyrights, patents, trademarks, industrial design, and geographical indication. So, licensing intellectual property. Licensing happens when someone who owns intellectual property, which is called a licensor, agrees to allow someone else to use that property for a specified fee or royalty. And we'll talk about what a royalty is later on. But someone who owns intellectual property is allowing someone else to use their intellectual property for a specific use, whatever they want to do with it, which is specified in the agreement we'll talk about a little bit later on, and they get a fee or a royalty from that. And so that's what licensing is. It's allowing someone to borrow, someone to use the property which you own. And there's three types of licensing, which we won't talk about these today. I just thought it'd be good to include these in here so that we all know what we're talking about. These are three common types of licensing. We have technology licensing agreement, trademark licensing agreement, copyright licensing agreement. And so each one of these are exactly what they sound like. They are licensing the three things mentioned: technology, trademark, and copyright. These things are owned by someone, and they're going to be licensed to someone else to use for a specific fee or royalty. So, licensing with a royalty, what does that mean? So royalty is a sum of money that's paid to a licensor each time the licensee makes a sale. So what that means is the person who owns the intellectual property, who is allowing someone else to use the intellectual property, each time that person makes a sale, the person who owns the intellectual property will get a sum of money from the sale. Now, this changes depending on the agreement. Each agreement will be different, but normally it's a small percentage, normally somewhere between 5 to 10%. Normally you don't go 10, 15, 20% royalty, but I have seen that before. But most of the time it's going to be right around 10%, 12% royalty, and that's normally what the licensor will ask for. And it's actually a great thing to do, licensing your intellectual property rather than transferring. And we'll get what transfer is at the very end. But the reason why is because you get a royalty. You get a flow of cash coming in constantly, not just a one-time exchange of money coming your way. You actually have a flow of cash coming in constantly from the sales that are being made on it. And also, licensing also allows you to retain the ownership of the intellectual property. So what you're doing is you're allowing someone else to use your intellectual property, but you still maintain ownership of that property. It's still your property, but you're allowing someone else to use it. And there's many different reasons why you would do this. I think the most common reason is because you have someone who owns intellectual property, such as maybe a patent, but it's not being used. They're not actually selling it. They're not actually distributing it. They're not actually producing it, and so they want to license their intellectual property. They want to license their patent to someone who will produce it, someone who will sell it, someone who will actually bring money in. And by doing so, they'll have a stream of money coming in from allowing them to use their property. And so let's say someone you had a design for a new product out and you have not distributed it, you haven't made a prototype of it, you haven't done anything like that, but you want to take this and allow someone else to take your idea and use it and make money off of it. You can allow someone to take your property, sell it, and then each time they sell that product, you can then get a royalty off of it, maybe 8% or 12% of the sale that they make. And so it's a great way to do that by still maintaining the ownership of the property itself while still making money off of it. And so a licensing agreement, we just mentioned this above here. I'll show you up here the technology licensing agreement, trademark licensing agreement, and copyright licensing agreement. And so we have agreements that have to be made each time that you want to license any kind of intellectual property. And basically a licensing agreement is just like any other agreement or contract. And basically what it's there for, it's there to specify what is happening in the exchange, as well as it's there to protect the licensor and the licensee. So it's there to protect the ownership that you have over your intellectual property. I'm not going to go over all of these, but your licensing agreement includes your grant clause, improvements, considerations, infringement, due diligence, indemnities, and product liabilities, dispute resolutions, transferability, and terminations. And each one of these are there to protect you. It's there to protect the licensee, and it's there to protect the intellectual property itself. And so real quickly, going over a few of these that are important to talk about. We'll talk first about grant clause. So a grant clause first is setting forth what patent rights are being conveyed. So what they're doing is they're first saying, okay, is this going to be an exclusive or a non-exclusive deal? Is this limited to a specific place, in the world? What field of use can this be used for? All that kind of stuff. And we'll talk about in the next slide. We'll talk about what the difference is between exclusive and non-exclusive licensing. But for now, we'll move on. Improvements. Do the people that you are licensing your intellectual property to have the right to make improvements on the technology or on the patent or whatever it may be that you're licensing? Or is that only for the owner to do, for the licensor to do? You see, you have the transferability, which basically allows the licensee to assign the intellectual property. They have the right to prevent a competitor from obtaining the intellectual property that he possesses. Then you have termination, which just says that for what reasons the agreement can be terminated, and if so, how will it be terminated? And so these are just basic things that are there to protect you and protect your intellectual property and to protect the licensee. Exclusive and non-exclusive license. So this is very simple. Again, it's just mentioned in the grant clause, which we just talked about. We said, is this going to be a exclusive or non-exclusive license that's going to be given to the licensee? And what that means is that if it's exclusive, that the licensor grants the right to use the intellectual property to one person. So that means that if I want to allow one person or one business to use my intellectual property, my patent, then they are allowed to do so. And it's exclusive, it's only for them. But if I want to have a non-exclusive license, then that basically means that I'm allowed to, as the owner, to license my intellectual property to multiple people. I can license it to multiple parties, multiple different companies, multiple whoever it may be. I can do it. I can license my intellectual property to whomever I want to. And so these have to be discussed in your licensing agreements with the person that you're licensing it to, because they may or may not want to have it licensed out to other parties. And there can be money to be made there if you do keep it exclusive. But also, there's also a lot of money to be made if you have non-exclusive licensing. You see a lot of non-exclusive licensing when it comes to the medical field, for example. And lastly, transfer intellectual property. I didn't talk a lot about this because it's pretty simple, and it's just in contrast with licensing. But basically, intellectual property can be licensed, as mentioned before, which means that you maintain ownership of that intellectual property, but it can also be transferred out. But transferred means that when you sell it, when you give it to a licensee, it's not just a licensee anymore. You're actually transferring the ownership to that person. So you no longer own the intellectual property that you're selling. You're selling it. You get a one-time payment. You get a one-time fee, and they then maintain ownership of that, and you no longer own it. Most times this is not something that you want to do, but universities do this, and there's a lot of other different reasons you may do this, but most of the time people do licensing instead because they maintain a steady flow of cash flow while doing that. And here are the references that I use while researching licensing and transfer of intellectual property. I hope y'all enjoy it. Thank you.